start. We might actually go back and see if we can cut this out of our webcast recording and just hear a little bit from Marg and Nathan. In summary, the last two questions, which you might have missed, which were telling us a little bit about themselves and their background in volunteer management and what their current role entails. So I'll pass it over to Marg first, and thank you again so much.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks everybody for hanging in there. There's nothing more frustrating. So I started my career as a nurse, moved into community health, and then ended up as a consultant to Veterans Affairs, where we ran some programs that were looking at social isolation, and they were entirely volunteer run, supported by the department. So that's very much where my interest in volunteer and volunteer management began in the early 2000s. My role at the moment is as volunteer program manager for Zoos Victoria. So we have 850 volunteers presently across 3 sites. So for those of you who may not be from Victoria, so Melbourne Zoo, Werribee Open Range Zoo and Healesville Sanctuary. Around half of those volunteers are at Healesville Sanctuary. That's by far where our largest number of volunteers are. And most of those roles are in the visitor space, helping give tours and wayfinding information, although there are a number of behind the scenes roles. But probably to dispel any myths, there's no roles that actually involve animal care, direct animal care or direct animal husbandry.
Thanks, Marg. I'll hand over to you, Nathan.
Thank you, Sarah. Just to recap, I'm from Very Special Kids. My introduction to volunteer management came through working in large church environments for 14 years as a minister, and volunteers, I guess, are the lifeblood of those kinds of communities. In 2014, I attended a volunteer information session at Very Special Kids and really fell in love with the space, and kind of left there with an overwhelming sense that, I'd love to make a contribution to that. And Very Special Kids runs Victoria's only children's hospice. And while we're kind of, called a children's charity, we're really a family-based charity and aim to support, the entire family when a family has a child or children with a life-limiting condition. So I'm the family support team volunteer coordinator, and I look after all the training, recruitment, care of volunteers that work directly with the families we're supporting, either in our hospice, in some of the children's hospitals, in home volunteer programs right around Victoria.
Thanks. So now we're going to dive into our nominated topic for today. And just to recap a little for those who are not aware, just a quick overview. The National Standards of Volunteer Involvement are the recognised best practice guidelines for organisations who want to involve volunteers, and were created by Volunteering Australia with input from volunteer managers across the sector. There have been a few iterations of the best practice standards, and the first iterations go back to the late 1990s. There are currently 8 standards covering leadership and management, commitment to volunteer involvement, volunteer roles, recruitment and selection, support and development, workplace safety and well-being, volunteer recognition, and quality management and continuous improvement. If you want more information about the standards, I'd suggest you pause this webinar and go look up the Volunteering Australia website before going any further. But to get back into it with you, Marg and Nathan, I wanted to start by asking you about when you first came across the standards, the national standards, and what you initially thought about the idea of standards of best practice for volunteer involvement. Marg?
I think for me, it was right back in the 90s, and we were looking at consultative groups through programs that were being funded by home and community care back in the day, because it was actually a set of standards that started there, that evolved and then became the national standards. I was around for sort of the first iteration of them. In terms of whether, we thought they were a good thing, it was all very unknown, but I think most people were very keen to have something like that to start to give direction to their volunteer programs.
For me, Nathan, it probably was a little bit later than that, probably 2009, 2010. It's hard to remember exactly, but I was leading a significant restructure in the programs of the church I was involved in at the time, and looking at how to better utilise, facilitate, grow our volunteer community. And I was kind of searching for some sort of structure or framework that could really help us do that. And that's where I stumbled across these things. And for me, it was great because in some areas, it really showed that we were on the right track and doing some wonderful things, but then it also gave some wonderful insights into some things that we hadn't really thought of, and ways that we could really, I guess, bolster what it is that we're trying to do.
Wonderful. Yeah, I actually came to the standards probably even a little later than you, Nathan, as I was at a volunteer organisation that had a really well-established system. So I didn't actually realise that there was a national best practice guidelines until a little later on in the piece. But once you both discovered the standards, I'm curious to know how you went about introducing them to your organisation. Were your organisations already aware of them? Did you have to convince management, the board, the volunteers themselves that, establishing the standards were actually a good idea?
Well, for me, I think when I first came across it, the standards weren't, I guess, used right across the sector, but it wasn't sort of adopted by the board or anything like that. It was more I was using it for myself in trying to work out how to best do what it is that I was trying to do. Moving to very special kids was a completely different story, because the standards really made up a significant part of what my position description looked like. And very special kids had a long-standing reputation of trying to implement that, and it was well adopted by all parts of the organisation, from the top to the bottom, and everywhere from the left to the right. So, so that was a really great thing.
I think from my perspective, it wasn't so much about convincing anybody. Certainly our senior management and our board have always been very, very much on board with it. And from the volunteers' perspectives, there's probably been elements that have been challenging, but overall, I think it's been a really positive experience. I think I've always had a great lot of organisational support.
That's fantastic to hear. I think sometimes, set of standards, safety standards are things that once you know about them and once you can understand the purpose, can feel very, established and recognised. But, I'm sure people, remember times when safety guidelines in cars and wearing seatbelts and, best practice guidelines for those weren't, quite as accepted as they are today. So I'm curious to know what process you went through with your organisation to ensure that you were meeting the standards. Did you have a formal process with the Zoom, Marg?
Yeah, so it's something that I guess we're working towards and working on all the time. One of the first things is doing a gap analysis, because it's quite surprising, and a lot of organisations out there might find the whole idea of implementing the national standards really daunting, but you'd be quite surprised when you perhaps look at what you do and the way you do some things already would be meeting standards. So looking at a gap analysis to see where the bulk of your effort really needs to be directed. The other thing is that the new standards, as they stand, are very scalable and adaptable. And so you need to know how that's going to then look and work in your organisation in terms of the indicators. So one of the examples that just brings to mind for me is standard 1, I think it's 1.4, where it says volunteer records shall be kept. Now, for a lot of organisations, that could be done in an exercise book with a pen and paper, but for us, we actually drew up our own indicators around what that means for our organisation. So the volunteer management system that we use, and then how and when that needs to be updated and how it needs to be kept, etc., etc. So perhaps looking at those standards and then looking at the indicators and adapting them for your circumstances.
Yeah, that's probably pretty similar for myself, given that the standards make up, I guess, what we're trying to achieve. They are scalable, depending on your size of your organisation. So as you grow, your practice constantly changes. And so for me, we may have a practice of reviewing what it is that we do. So looking at all our policies, the processes, our culture, our onboarding training, everything like that, every single year, and trying to work out, based on the standards, in what ways can we do things better, what things need to change as we grow, what other things do we need to implement, what things do we let go of, and so we kind of use that. So it makes up a big part of my PDP every single year, and at the end of each year, we sit down with my manager and set some new goals based on what it is that we want to achieve and what we want to look like, and then we review those constantly.
Great, thanks. And yeah, it really was the intention, I think, of Volunteering Australia to make the standards as scalable as possible. When it comes to volunteer recognition at a larger organisation can look so different to volunteer recognition at a smaller organisation. I've been involved with, smaller organisations with absolutely no budget, and the things we do to recognise volunteering is very different. But having a commitment to recognising volunteer effort, is certainly something that can be a standard, consistent across the sector, no matter how large or how small an organisation it is. So just wanted to ask, did you have any particular challenges along the way for how you implemented the standards at your particular organisation? Marg?
Look, I think there's always challenges, and there's always challenges both big and small, but the one thing that I found is oftentimes in management generally, and possibly volunteer management, sometimes even more so, I guess our default position is writing communication. So we'll put this in the newsletter, or we'll put it out as written communication. And whilst there's nothing wrong with that as sort of part of your arsenal, it's often even the best written documents can be misinterpreted. So from my perspective, and I'd say this not just for the standards, but any sort of change management process, is really get out there as much as you can, doing face-to-face communication. It not only helps to sort of get rid of any of those grey areas, or it just helps to address rumour mill stuff and gives people the opportunity to answer questions directly and get answers directly.
How about you, Nathan? Any particular challenges or memorable challenges, and how did you address them?
Yeah, sure. And just to answer the question on there, PDP is Performance Development Plan. And so that's something that everyone in our organisation does on an annual basis. And so basically what that looks like is with my manager, we review all the, I guess, big changes, goals that we want to make. Big improvements or big changes, big ideas go into an overall strategic plan for the organisation, and then smaller steps in how we get to those things and all the reviews and changes then get put into, I guess, my own personal PDP, personal development plan, and there are certain goals that we're trying to hit throughout the year to make sure that we're achieving those things. And so I guess when we talk about challenges, there's always going to be challenges, because any kind of review and any means change. And I think the biggest challenge that people come up against, particularly I think in a volunteer sector, and particularly for people that have been there a long time and are used to doing something in a certain way, change becomes very hard for some people to embrace. And so it's really about trying to, I guess, journey with people through any of those changes, giving reason as to why we're making those changes, and really trying to help step them through it in a good way.
Yeah, often things like changes kind of based on standards. If people can understand the logic behind, most people can accept a lot of different changes of process. So most people, you just want to ensure that you're not sort of arbitrarily, making changes here or there. So I'm curious a little bit. You're from different sectors. So Nathan, your sector is really health, and kind of a sector that's quite highly regulated. And Marg, you're from a sort of hybrid sector of an environmental organisation, but also a cultural institution. I'm interested to hear whether, the different sectors that you're in, you're from, because obviously we know volunteering cuts across a whole bunch of different sectors, whether that influenced the way the standards were accepted by your management or also the volunteers themselves. Nathan?
Yeah, so I think being in, a health sector, we're probably pretty used to auditing and having to meet a whole wide range of standards. And we just had an audit at the end of last year, which was quite a big process, but it went really well. And so we kind of already had that culture of reviewing, of documentation, of change implementation, of all those sorts of things. But even whilst as an organisation, from a staff point of view, there is very much that culture, it still does pose a challenge for volunteers, particularly when volunteers, I think, come in with a particular idea of how they want to contribute and the things that they want to be able to do and not want to do. Unfortunately, best practice does mean that we need to set expectations a little bit higher than maybe what we used to, which can be hard for some people to get their head around.
Thanks, Nathan. We are a little bit different, I think, Sarah, as you said, because we are an environmental organisation, a conservation organisation. We're also a cultural institution, and we're also a statutory body of the Victorian government. So in terms of having systems and reporting, it's sort of, very daily bread and butter for us. But the other thing that has happened in the last few years at Zoos Victoria is we've moved into looking at our organisation, I guess, through the lens of lean management, LEAN. And for people out there that want to read up on that, it came out of the Toyota production system originally in Japan, just a different way of looking at management and looking at standards. And it is very much lean about having standards. So I guess it kind of, the national standards and volunteering generally dovetails quite nicely in with lean.
Right, and so this will likely be a quick one, and I think does cover some of the questions I've, seen pop up. But how often, have you reviewed the standards since implementing them?
Well, as mentioned before, really try to do it in a big way on a year-to-year basis, looking at, I guess, all our policies, processes, procedures, and then refining that based on what it is, or I guess where it is that we want to go and what it is that we want to look like, based on each of those 8 standards.
Very much the same for us. So we audit against them annually. and also we review them. So we're really looking at, as I said, with those indicators, the standards of course don't change, but those indicators as to how we're going to meet them for our organisation, we're always just constantly tweaking that upwards.
And so, you know, thinking about some of the people who've logged on to this webinar who might not have implemented the standards of their organisations, based on, you know, having worked to the standards of both of your organisations for a little while now and having undertaken review processes, what advice would you give to organisations that are looking to start this process? Marg?
The first one would be reach out. Volunteering Victoria, of course, but also your peers in the area of volunteer management. There's plenty of people out there who are more than happy to help give advice on that. Spend real-time planning and communicating what those plans are. Also, probably just one plea from me would be, don't treat it as a box ticking exercise. This is about real standards that will raise the level in your workplace for everybody and really honour the work that your volunteers do. So it's more than a box ticking exercise. And the other thing, going back to the answers that we just had to the previous question, know that you're never going to be finished. This is an ongoing process.
Yeah, I would say, and there's a question there about how much consultation do we I guess have with volunteers. We actually have a lot of consultation with our volunteer teams. So when it comes to implementing these standards, we have quarterly team meetings where we debrief and hear about the practice of our volunteers, and from there we take a lot of notes and ideas from them on the ground as to what it is that can change, might need to change, tighten up, all those sorts of things. So I guess if you are looking to implement, I guess you want to form some sort of working group, which might include a couple of volunteers. Remembering not all volunteer voices are equal, and consultation is great. Too much consultation can really impede any progress. And so you really got to pick the voices that you want to hear and want to include. As Marg said, visit other organisations that are further down the track, maybe not necessarily, you know, way down the track, like organisations that are just a little bit further ahead of you, and pick their brains as to what it is that they've been doing. Attend the Volunteer Victoria training sessions that they run each year is a great little insight. You yourself need to have a vision and a plan regarding what it is that you want your program to look like. Put proposals together, talk it through with management, and then I guess got to put a plan together that you're going to be sort of working towards. And so maybe it's not necessarily a good idea to try to implement significant changes in all the 8 standards at once, but maybe you pick one every 2 months that you're trying to work on, and then review that in 8 months' time, and you go back to the first one you looked at and work out what needs to change and what needs to be tweaked. And then, as Marg said, you're constantly reviewing it again and again and again. And I guess that's just the practice of best practice, review and change.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's really a constantly evolving process. So we have, you know, a few more questions. I'm wondering, is there a particular conversation that you had with a volunteer or management that left an impression about how the change, so how implementing the national standards was viewed at your organisation?
Look, I think broadly it was a positive thing, and I think again this is when you actually got the chance to explain these things face to face with people. Anything can be viewed as threatening if it's not explained well, and then as Nathan said, there are always going to be certain individuals who, for whatever reason, find any form of change a little bit threatening, and to a degree they feel disempowered by it. I was approached by one lady who, and this was, I guess, in a broader context around changes that we'd made in training, who said, you know, she was really angry actually, that she approached me and she said, I can't possibly think what you would teach me. And
oh no.
and so I said, well, you know, if we have a fire at the moment and we need to evacuate, what sector are we in? She said, what? I said, what sector are we in? She said, I haven't got the first clue what you're talking about. And I said, well, there you go, I might be able to teach you something. So it was being able face to face to correct, you know, those ideas that I'm out there to somehow erode what basic training or understanding they already had, but to add to that and to honour the contribution they're making by keeping them safe and those sorts of things. And again, that's where I feel being able to get out one-on-one and address those challenges is a really good thing.
So to move along a little bit, what are the, you know, I'll ask you to just what you think the top 3 factors are for running an excellent volunteer program in your opinion?
Well, I think you need to, number one, make sure that your volunteers can articulate how what they do contributes to the mission of the organisation they are a part of. I think nothing disenfranchises a volunteer more than leaving feeling that what they've just given, the hours they've just given, hasn't made a significant contribution. So you really want to make sure people can articulate for themselves how what they're doing is really investing into the cause that they are a part of. Number 2, I think you need to understand your organisation's needs and work out how you and your volunteer base can add value, because we, I guess, the lifeblood of our organisations. We are the single biggest resource that they have, and we are there to resource the vision of this organisation. And so we need to listen really intently to all the various teams and personnel that you are working alongside, and not just stick to what it is, I think, that has always been done, but work out what is the growing contribution that can be made. And then number 3, I think you need to protect the culture of your organisation and your volunteer community. You really need to interview well. You need to, I think, be choosy, because I think for a lot of organisations, the volunteer base really does set the culture of their organisation. You need to make it fun, set high standards and expectations for your volunteers.
My original answer to this question was communication 1, 2 and 3, but certainly a couple of points there that Nathan made and that I really strongly agree with. Your volunteers do need to understand your vision and mission, and that's not necessarily to say that they need to be able to recite it chapter and verse as it appears in the annual report, but they do understand where you as an organisation are heading and be on board with that and want to contribute to that. And again, that sense of being able to measure what they're doing and have some sort of feedback loop for that, I think is really, really important.
No, that's great. We might just go to have one final question from me, and then we'll address some of your questions that have come through the Q&A and the chat box. And again, thanks for all of your participation today, particularly in letting us know of some of the technical difficulties. So to wrap things up, what do you think are the challenges and the opportunities for volunteering, into the future? Are you happy to take this one first, Marg?
Question without notice. I think the challenges for volunteering moving forward, it's probably one of those questions that you'd almost just say, what are challenges for society moving forward? It's just, volunteering is such just an integral part of what we do now as a community, as a nation. And so a lot of the challenges, a lot of the changes that are coming our way as a society as a whole, naturally are going to flow on and impact volunteering. That's also, of course, got the opposite side, the flip side, which is the opportunities. the way in which we're communicating now to our peers out there via the webinar is another example of some of the great ways that you know, we're all time poor. One of the first things we all know as leaders of volunteers is we're all time poor. To be able to use technology in this way to reach out to others in the sector, but also how we're going to do that with our volunteers is going to make enormous inroads.
Yeah, I'd say one of the biggest challenges would be the lack of margin that we in society live with. I think for a lot of families and a lot of people, they pack out every single day of the week with whole various things, and that idea of contribution to community often is, you know, drops down the last thing on the list. The opportunities that are there, though, like I love seeing the change in school curriculum, which is really, you know, right from primary school into secondary school, and even universities really trying to create space and promote the idea of contribution that we could all make whatever age, and really setting that as a culture within our own personal lives, I think is a great thing. So I actually think potentially in the future, we might actually have a more generous society as this further rolls out within our education sense.
Thanks, guys. And so now we'll go to a few of the questions that have come through some of the chat, and we'll do our best to address some of them. So the first question I feel we've probably addressed, which was around whether Marg and Nathan, you review the standards on a yearly basis, or whether you have another arrangement. And yeah.
Formally yearly, but that's not to say that tweaks aren't made in between that as well.
Thanks. So the next question was around whether or not it's mandatory for all volunteers in healthcare to have a working with children's check and a police check. You know, the working with children's check legislation applies to all volunteers across all sectors in Victoria. So it is mandatory for volunteers who are working with children and have direct contact with children from their volunteer roles. You know, they're mandatory across all roles. But that said, organisations, if there's a volunteer opportunity that does not have a working with children component, they may not require it for that role. Is there anything you guys would like to add to that?
No, we have working with children checks for all our volunteers. We don't require police checks.
And I guess it's important to note that police checks and working with children's checks, while the working with children's checks are very legislative, police checks is often a decision that's made on a risk basis by various organisations.
So for us, police checks are a requirement, and then with our family services team as well, there is a whole heap of safety, hand hygiene modules, online modules and training that everyone needs to do on a yearly basis as well.
Thanks. So the next question was really, I think, a challenging one for the sector, and if there's a magic ingredient, you know, I'll be keen to hear it from these two, but it's basically asking how you balance compliance requirements and standards for a new volunteer joining. How can you show them that jumping through all the compliance hoops will be worth it once they're in the role? And have you used any strategies that have been successful in the past?
Well, to volunteer with the family support team, there is a lot of hoops that a volunteer needs to go through. And so actually from attending an information session to actually starting to volunteer could be a process of about 9 months before they actually end up doing anything with any of the families. And so for us, I take them through a 9-week training program, 27 hours of face-to-face in a group, and making sure they really do understand everything that is involved in the roles that they will be doing, both from an emotional point of view and from a legislative point of view as well. And so for me, you know, if anyone has concerns about not wanting to do any of that, well, that's an instant red flag, and it's probably not someone I want in my volunteer community, and so they get cut out pretty quickly.
I think that you can look at this a couple of ways, and when you really break it down into what is being asked of people, and I know a lot of people would say, you know, I'm here giving my time to you. Why do you want me to jump through all these hoops? Why do I have to do this? If for a moment I just use Nathan's organisation as an example, the profile of the sensitive nature and the type of work that these volunteers are going to be doing, and the people that they're going to be exposed to, and at the time in their lives that they're going to be exposed to it, you really do want people who are committed, who are well trained, who are the best of the best. And that's for their own protection, you know, as well as for the client base that you're servicing. And I know sometimes, devil's advocate here, as a volunteer manager, you may have pressure on you to just, where are the numbers, where are the numbers, where are the numbers? But think about the 80-20 rule, and I'll guarantee you it's about 20% of your volunteers that take up 80% of your time. And whether or not having that person on board simply to get another number on there and avoid jumping through the hoops, how problematic that can be down the track if they're resistant to you know, coming to training, putting in the time and finding out what your organisation is really about, and, you know, understanding through training and those sorts of things. It can be daunting for some people, and they do feel that they're being asked a lot of. But my view on that is that hopefully your organisation is going to give them a fantastic volunteering experience that is really robust and in which they're really supported. And so you want that reciprocity from both sides. You want them to be able to be prepared to put in, and that you'll be there for them on the other side.
Yeah, and right from the start of recruiting, all their information sessions and all those sorts of things, there are no surprises. Like, before a person actually takes an application form, they are told everything that they're going to need to do before they even have to put their name on a sheet of paper. Yeah. And we give people thinking time from information session to think, is this something you are really prepared to do and want to follow through with as well? So I think as long as you show the reasoning in a really good way, you go on the journey with them and you give everything up front, then usually you stamp out some of those issues.
Yeah, and look, that's been my experience as a former, like a volunteer manager myself, that, you know, often setting the expectation is really just the most important thing in terms of balancing some of those compliance hoops, but also really, I guess, reiterating what the compliance is for. But it is just a delicate balance, and something that we as volunteer managers have to adjust to every time there are, you know, changes in terms of some of those compliance requirements. And there's one final question on there that says, as a volunteer, do I have to pay for the training sessions? I believe that might be referring to, you know, training for volunteers at Very Special Kids. No, that's part of their volunteer experience. But in terms of volunteering Victoria training sessions, the information for that is on our website.
And we don't charge for training either.
No.
We've got plenty of answers sorted.
Yes, absolutely. So look, I'll wrap things up here, and really just wanted to thank you all for bearing with us during our technical difficulties at the start. We really, really appreciate it, and hopefully we will be a very well-oiled machine by the time we come back and bring you the next webinar next month. And I really thank Marg and Nathan hugely for their time today, but also their willingness to go first, which is not always easy. A few just solid reminders before we finish this webinar is basically that our next webinar is scheduled for the 7th of March. And we have Adele Stoe-Lindner from RDoc and Kerry Uren from Interchange Incorporated. And they're going to be talking about building an evidence base in programs and volunteer programs and what that looks like. Volunteering Victoria has, ongoing training and workshops, and available, all the information about those are available on our website. But courses that are currently coming up are the A to Z of volunteer management, a longer course on the national standards of volunteer involvement and how you get that process started at your organisation. Volunteer performance counselling, so dealing with the tough stuff. And finally, a little plug to consider. Volunteering Victoria runs a mentoring program which is available to our members. In previous years, both of today's guests have put their hands up for that. And it's a really great opportunity to become, both to get some individualized support, but also to become involved in the sector and reach out and make connections with other people who are involved in the sector. So once again, really thank you all for your time today. We will put this recording up online. Hopefully we'll be able to chop out the first bit where the technical difficulties were occurring, and really just thank you all for logging in, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.